Hello and welcome back to the Security Conversations podcast. My friend Juan Andres is here with us this week. We're going to shoot the breeze on nation state APTs, JuanCon, LabsCon, all the fun activities we've been up to through what are we in September now? Welcome to the show, Juan. How are you?
October.
Jeez. It is early October. How are you, my friend?
Yeah. I'm good. It's been ages since we've actually done this. So it's like 4 jobs ago and a few centuries in
This is true. This is true. You're a returning guest on the podcast, having been a guest in the early days when it was just started. Let's not waste too much time because I feel like I can always come to you and get a blunt, honest assessment of the APT space. And I want to start with one thing that comes out of Black Hat and Chris Krebs's bold statement that we've over-fetishized the APT. Is there a general agreement from your side of the house that we have allowed marketing and we've allowed all the sexiness of APT activity to dominate the landscape in a way where it's taking away attention from where it should be? How would you respond to that statement? Because that's your world, right?
Yeah, I don't respond with it with disagreement, but I would shift the focus. I would shift how you put that out there, right? Like it's not that we have over fetishized the APT. We should be worried about APTs. We should care that they're there. We should care that we are not very good at detecting them. It's that we have overestimated our maturity in general as defenders. Like threat intel is fantastic. It's great. It's delightful. You need it, etc. At a certain point of maturity. I think what we're learning is just how immature most defense organizations are, most IT programs are, even most governments are. So while you should care about APTs and you should consume threat intel, it turns out that a lot of these programs are in their infancy, and no, they should not prioritize that over all the things that should come along the way, the telemetry that you need, the solutions along the way, the general self-awareness that an organization should have before they can even respond to any of it. Like I can tell you, look, the APT is right there. And if you don't have any of the tooling to respond or to understand what's happening in your network, it doesn't mean anything. So in that sense, I think it's not the APT itself. It's the fact that like, it's very hard to market, eat your vegetables, turn on multi-factor, don't reuse
the foundational
your
things are all unsexy. The basics are largely unsexy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but at the same time, do you feel like the threat intelligence, let's call it an industry or whatever it is, has kind of run away from where defenders are? And the only people, like you just mentioned, the only people who can actually consume and start doing threat hunting and doing any of that stuff at scale has to have like a certain level of maturity in the organization where the security program is humming along with all the basics already built in. And threat intel is a bolt-on, an important bolt-on. But a bolt-on. I just had this conversation with Will Lin, my friend over at ForgePoint, and we were talking about categories, like product categories that like hits and misses over the years. Like mobile security never became a category, it just never became a thing. And he's making the argument that threat intelligence is one of those that will never become a thing. It's one of those small bolt-on things that adds on there. And I feel like the Chris Krebs statement put it into a different perspective. When he talked about fetishizing, I got the sense he was talking more along the lines of headline grabbing and some of the bigger type conversations and not going down to the nitty-gritty.
There's like 3 things in there that I would tackle kind of differently.
In the
sense of like what Chris Krebs is talking about as far as the way that I take it. And I think Chris is great for the sake of like getting some very like dry top-down perspective on the industry is, who gives a damn about the APT when you have like these 17-year-olds in Lapsus running circles around giant organizations and you have ransomware crews taking over countries. Like
not just giant organizations, but giant mature organizations with CISOs and like solid security infrastructure in place, right? Yeah. And if you can have a 16, 17-year-old like Lapsus, not only running havoc, but doing things where you yourself can't even figure out what they've done and how they've done it, and you're mucking up communications, you're mucking up all these things. It means that foundationally the basics aren't there still.
So there's that aspect of it where I think the APT kind of goes out of the picture. I think there's a lack of recognition of why marketing gravitates to APT stories, which we've kind of discussed before. So I don't want to like dig too deep into it, but essentially like human interest is what drives stories. It's what drives PR. So you're going to get a lot more of that from APT discussions, nation state discussions, or like, victimizing of specific individuals, etc. Those are hooks for PR. If I call a reporter tomorrow and I say, look, I just found the coolest malware because it does this fancy technical thing, they're going to hang up the phone. They're not going to write a story. But if I tell them it was used to hack, activists and whatever, or Biden, like that is a hook for a bigger story. In that sense, you're not going to shift those very normal human dynamics out of what the threat intel space ultimately provides for a lot of organizations. The third part is with, you mentioned Will Lin, and not to come at Will in particular, but rather the larger VC space. We know the VC space sponsors sexiness. Investment happens on FOMO. It almost always falls some bullshit trend that like it's this year's RSA buzzword, right? Like right now they're all obsessing over software supply chain attacks. Fantastic. Like they got the memo. Like 20 years too late, maybe 10 years too late from the APT side. And the reason I bring it up is I want to see more investment and build up of real security companies with real products that are making the basics something normal, consumable, approachable in a way that I can recommend it to somebody. Like my issue as a threat intel researcher is I'm having a grand old time focusing on these high level things. And then when I have to talk to somebody that wants to defend their org, well, I'm not going to go work for your damn organization, right? I'd be bored. I also am not a specialist in things like, how do you set up your AD properly and how do you, set up 2FA across an org. But I also don't have go-to organizations or products that I can be like, well, if you buy this from these guys and you set up this from those guys, then you're good to go. So it's very difficult to land the plane short of saying like, okay, well, I'm going to step off of my function in this industry and go somewhere else just so that people can figure out how to not use these fucking passwords, right? Like there's a failure of the ecosystem to substantiate its own steps. And then what we end up seeing is some of our own friends who are amazing researchers have to like step off the podium and go do it themselves because even though this is like however many multi-billion-dollar industry, most money is being put into bullshit. And most of what's being sold is like marketing garbage. So like, tips that don't work as tips and like endpoint products that don't produce endpoint telemetry. And like everyone ignoring that memory exists except for like one effing company. And, now we have like, our friend Alex at Binarly doing firmware, but like you look at these things, you're like, they're the same issues we've been discussing forever. And at best you get one real company. And then you have a lot of also rans that are just like selling marketing shadows where they're like, oh yeah, we do that. We do assessments of like your assets and vulnerability, whatever. And we can't answer the basic questions. Like you still can't answer what files have I ever had? What places have I ever connected to? How many assets do I actually have? Where are they connected? How are they structured? Like what identity has access to this, that, and the other and privileges and where have they been and what have they done?
Yeah, but I can name 25
basic
startups.
Inventory questions.
Right, but I can name 25 startups that are promising to solve that problem and they've been funded to the tune of $200 million. I mean, it comes back to this circular conversations about how VCs drive conversations and VC money drives conversations, and that money driving Gartner to create these categories and create these buckets and categories and lump sum of things where budgets have to go. And then what you find is the CISO with a strapped budget trying to figure out shiny toy, foundation, threat hunting, like what is the priority, and that's why we have a ransomware epidemic, right?
Like I want them to spend the money on the foundational. I don't want them to spend the money on threat intel. I want them to spend the money on the foundational stuff that means that threat intel can be applied. Because let's put it this way, like
threat intel actually works.
Right. If tomorrow I go full pro bono and I say, I'm going to go help people defend against APTX, and I go, okay, this organization has APTX in it, and I walk in, if the foundational stuff is not taken care of, I'm not going to be able to do anything. And that's the part that I want people to understand. Like, it's not magic. You need to be able, no one is going to know your network better than you do. And if you don't know your network, it means the only people that know your network are the attackers. Right. That's it. It's not like threat intel people get to know the attackers. They don't get any more familiar with what your network looks like, what your defense stance looks like, and what they're going to be able to do at that point is incredibly limited.
Right. Are you worried about your part of the industry, the threat intel side of the house, speaking a completely different conversation from the conversation spoken by CISOs and security directors? And let me linger here for a second. We had Caleb Simas, CISO from Robinhood at LabsCon. We were having this conversation about, and we were consuming this LabsCon content, which was filled with threat intel, threat hunting type focus. And as a CISO there, he felt like this conversation didn't necessarily resonate directly with him, right? And he is managing and mitigating risk here, and there's a different conversation happening over here. And I feel like there's a bridge that's very, very difficult to cross. Do you find that at all in your conversations with folks?
In a sense, I mean, I don't personally have that difficult a time discussing with CISOs because I don't mind landing it into business concerns. I think a lot of folks in the threat intel space who are living the artist life and the life that I'd rather be living have that problem because they don't, when
somebody's got to buy this stuff.
Well, and let me roll that back a little, right? Like, I don't do sales, and I've specifically held that position at every company that I could for the past 10 years, and I'm going to continue to do that. Like, I don't like doing sales. I like being able to call the baby ugly. And more importantly, like, I like being able to express our limitations, right? Like, we're an XDR. Go talk to your network security provider about the other parts, right? Like, we can't do that for you. It stops here and it starts over there. And you can't do that when you're just trying to pimp out a product and you're trying to get someone on your platform. You also can't have an objective view of threat actors if you only decide that, like, the only telemetry that matters is ours and then everybody else's is bullshit. You can't do that. So I think that that's important. But on the CISO side, I think the bigger problems don't come from threat intel not speaking their language, but rather the CISO ecosystem is very strange. And it's driven by
Expand on that a little bit.
Well,
why do you find it strange?
I find it incredibly strange because it's a job that is essentially built on the wrong motivators in a lot of ways. It's one that entails, like, you've come in to be the sacrificial lamb of this organization. It essentially, we know that the failures that happen here, regardless of whether they're your fault, are going to be pinned on you as a CISO. Given your, whatever your performance may or may not be, in a space for which there are so many levers that you do not control. So, like, I admire people who are willing to take the job. They're willing to say, I'm going to be the face of information security for this organization. And presumably you walk into that organization, unless you got promoted, you're walking into that organization to find out what the culture looks like, if you have a sponsor, if someone's going to give you political top cover, if someone's going to invest into your initiatives, if someone is going to get, if they have the tooling that you expected, how popped they are from the time before you got there, right?
I mean,
CISOs don't necessarily...
We just had this described in detail by Mudge, right? Like Mudge getting into Twitter and finding it 10 years behind Facebook and Google. And that's an organization. Exactly.
Oh, the responses to the whole, like, look, I'm an ardent supporter of Mudge. On a personal level, I think he's an amazing human being. I also see him just as somebody who's clearly been comfortable speaking truth to power for, longer than I've been in this industry. And I admire that. I was very dismayed by the responses to Mudge speaking up. Particularly, there's the side of the house that wanted to be all conspiratorial and talk about Elon Musk deal, whatever. I don't care about that. Like, forget that bit. But there were a lot of realpolitik, pragmatic descriptions of what the executive, C-suite should look like, and how much just didn't know how to fall into place and didn't know how the real world works, kid. And like, that was very strange. It was very strange to me because essentially it invalidates the notion of a legitimate whistleblower in an executive setting. It invalidates the notion of any responsibility to customers, right? The idea is, if your board is willing to say, or your CEO is willing to say, don't worry, we're going to sort this out in the next 18 months. The fact that everything looks terrible and that we're not doing anything about it doesn't matter. We're going to sort this out in the future. Right. That you, a person like Mudge or like me or whomever that has any credibility in the space is supposed to rubber stamp that and accept it and keep moving. Regardless of the fact that they could fire you in 6 months, regardless of the fact that, like, at the end of the day, no one from outside Twitter, no customer of Twitter or content provider of Twitter really has any assurance or has any understanding of what the roadmap may or may not be and if you'll ever get there or not. So like things like Errata Rob being like edgelord, you just don't understand how executives work, to me was more an admission of accepting this like deep moral corruption that has to take a back seat to, are we making enough money? Do we have the right business model? Right. Whatever. And frankly, while I do understand that that is real, you can't spend money you don't necessarily have. You do need to have a strong business in order to drive certain things. We're not talking about a mom and pop shop. We're talking about a company like Twitter that's been around for just as long as, places like Facebook and others that have managed incredibly mature threat intel organizations, and who know that their business is PII, who know that they're going to get into political territorial battles with people in India, with people in China, with people in all these places, and have just developed processes around that. And instead we're looking at Twitter, it's not a freaking startup, it's not 50 people.
It's a multi-billion-dollar company. It's a
multi-billion-dollar. It might not be as many billions as people wish they were, but you can't make the argument that it's not in a position to defend itself. It's absolutely ridiculous.
But it comes back to the point you were making around CISOs not having top-level support and CISOs not having the level of sponsorships that help them figure out a way to be transformational. Because the other thing is CISOs, they're 18 to 36 months and they're gone to the next gig. There's a lot of turnover. There's the CISO tenures are becoming shorter and shorter. And how can you make decisions for the long-term interest of the company when you're trying to shore up these things? And I feel like the other thing gets lost in the Mudge thing, and you talked about the response to it and the response, the anti-whistleblower response to it, is a shocking acceptance of poor security practices and posture at these big organizations. Like Mudge comes out and talks in detail, tremendous detail about everything that he saw wrong and going in the wrong directions and all the data points he shared. And everyone looks past all of that and says, oh, yeah, this is just how it is in corporate world today. It's just like, I feel like it's a defeatist mentality that's...
It's not just a defeatist mentality. It's we have a tendency as human beings towards overgeneralization. And it's what allows us to create patterns. It's what allows us to identify similarities in vastly incongruous situations, which is fantastic. I mean, that's how our brains work, and that's great. However, in this case, what it became was lumping our defeatist maxims about vague organizations and making them apply to everything.
Right.
And I think that also comes from not knowing what good security standards look like at big companies. Facebook has an unbelievable structure around access controls and knowing who accesses what data and uses it how. Same with Google. I mean, look, I can criticize Google all day and tag, whatever, all these things, but I admire Google as an organization for their security practices.
They got beyond corporate zero trust right. I mean,
everything. I mean, Heather Atkins, what she has put through and what she has seen this org through, and, from its humble beginnings with, Mike Wiseck back there and Shane and everyone, to what it is now. is amazing. And they have actually put books out and stuff and whatever on this. But the truth is that I think folks don't understand that when you're at that level, you should know where your data goes, who gets to see it, what they do with it, and when. And then it's trivial to raise a red flag and go, why did somebody who works over here go look at the messages of somebody over there? Like, that should be, I understand if you're small and coming up and depending on somebody else for your tooling and you don't know that. Okay.
As soon as you get to a level of maturity, there needs to be guardrails there, right? Like,
so
it's basic.
When you get to Twitter, what we're talking about is an unwillingness to know and not caring to invest into it and accepting not just business as usual, but I'm going to let the regulators from country X do whatever the hell they want. And
right.
The people who are rogue insiders do whatever the hell they want. And that, at that point, what you're telling the CISO, what you're telling Mudge, when you're telling anybody else is, I don't want to know what I don't want to know. And then we can say we're safe.
That's a culture thing too, with a corporate organization that's willing to, like, I mean, he mentioned they were willing to absorb one-off fines. They're just assume that as part.
I think most orgs do. I think that, that's what you get into with, like, undefined regulations like GDPR, where it's like most giant American companies have said the EU every once in a while is going to bleed us for $50 million. Just pay the check and move on, right? Like, it's impossible to fall into regulations that are undefined. Whenever they want us to write a check, just, it's a speeding ticket, move on. But, like, coming back to the CISO thing, I mean, I'm not criticizing the CISOs themselves. I'm saying the role is scoped in such a way where it's impossible to be successful. It asks you to jump in on faith. And then it essentially asks you as a figure to sign off on a lot of things that are the effects of your predecessors. Right. And as long as you keep your mouth shut after you leave, well done. Here's your executive, severance package, and let's all keep on
Go take
trucking.
another one. Go take another CISO gig somewhere else and do the same thing. All right. Now that we've gotten through the business thing, and we've kind of, can we go back to fetishizing the APT? One thing,
please. That's like my whole thing.
One thing I noticed recently, and you and I worked at Kaspersky Great for a while, and we had this notion around attribution where things were language speaking, Russian speaking, Farsi speaking, Chinese speaking APTs. Attribution of nation state campaigns have gotten a lot more direct these days. Right? Now you have the FBI joint advisories with CISA, you have Microsoft, you have Google, you have Facebook, like private sector, public sector, it doesn't matter. Directly pinpointing adversaries by name, directly pinpointing adversaries by country, by unit within the country. Why this change? Because for many years, you, Juan, and all your friends told me attribution is really, really, really difficult to get right and easy to get wrong. Suddenly, everyone is doing attribution. It's open season on attribution. Take the stage and help me understand what has changed, why it has changed, and is it for the better or for the worse?
Yes, to all of it, right? Like, so things have changed. Attribution on a technical level has not necessarily changed all that much. There were things that used to happen in secret that are now happening more openly. For example, you look at an organization like Facebook, you look at what they're disclosing in their threat intel reports, it includes a lot of attribution stuff. Well, think about it. Facebook is basically the private sector equivalent of what the NSA called Treasure Map. Like, it's this beautiful organization where you have a website where people identify themselves through an account that includes cookies,
their crimes,
that includes IPs, that includes their devices. Like, you basically have a perfect mapping from digital persona to devices. It allows you to do a lot of great things. They are more comfortable talking about that sort of thing openly now. What really changes the stage, and like, not to single out Facebook, there's a lot of organizations doing this, and they're all doing great threat intel work. They're just more open about it. But what changed the tone is 2014 Sony hack. The Obama administration comes out and says this was North Korea. That was a very big change in posture from the government, from the public sector, that has always been the leader on attribution. Right, whether it was, in all source attribution, right? When you have human assets and an economic understanding of the place and signals intelligence and the private sector giving you tidbits, you're in a position to coalesce all of that and say with a certain level of confidence, this was North Korea, blah, blah, blah. Right. the fact that they were willing to do that publicly, I think, changed the tone for the rest of the industry. Where all of a sudden, hey, look, it's getting a little more acceptable. And here comes Intrusion Truth, who nobody knows who they are, who's pinpointing individuals. And then, you get some false starts in the private sector, but then also some other reports where you're like, wow, like these guys were willing to, come out and come to a ledge and say, look, we don't know everything we don't know. And here's the shaky foundations of what we do know, but it does seem to really point to these individuals. So I think technical attribution has not gotten easier. It has also not developed greater certainty. But what you have is a space where I can hitch my wagon to a government announcement. I can say, look, I have these indicators. I have a technical connection to the same thing that the FBI was talking about, and they said it's so-and-so. My indicators vaguely move in that direction too. So let's just, if you're being responsible, you kind of outline this logical tree of relationships. Right,
but you're putting a lot of blind trust in what governments will say, right? And they have their own motivations. And I'll throw one at you. China has started doing their own APT reports blaming USA, and right? I mean, you laugh. Exactly. China's just suddenly found out that Rob Joyce was at the NSA.
They sussed it out of him.
No, but my point is, when you allow governments to lead attribution, you're going on blind faith, blind trust that this is all reliable.
But we're laughing because it's so blatantly politicized and such low quality, right?
Well, it's the same here, though. Let's be fair. Is it not politicized here? Come on.
No. Look, you can take something apolitical and make a political statement out of it, but I don't think that you can look at the major. Look, no.
Can I push back a little bit? Let's look at the Albania thing.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that was political attribution for a very, 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 very specific, very, very obvious signaling, but it was a political operation.
It's a political operation. I don't think it's political attribution. And having admittedly worked on the Albania case from one angle, I know Microsoft worked from another angle. CISA was involved. A lot of folks were involved. It was actually, I think, a case where attribution was very helpful in that you have a nation state hitting a third party in the middle of a bizarre, it's a sort of proxy attack in the middle of a bizarre conflict, right? You have Israel and Iran kind of hitting back at each other all day. And then, Israel obviously has 10 times the might of Iran, and they're really shaking them up. So instead they go and hit like this random proxy over like this MEK battle, and pretend to be a ransomware group. And it's a NATO nation. So there's a lot of things in there where it's it's better that we come in and defuse a bomb and say, look, guys, it was the Iranians, it's this thing, and make your statements, and let's just all move on.
But this is not the only APT activity from these guys. Why was this one so special that caused embassy closings, that caused diplomatic issues? I feel like there's an Iranian APT attack happening in NATO countries every day.
Not so much destructive.
There's just something weird about this one, and I'm trying to understand why are we putting all this trust in governments doing the attribution and governments leading the private sector?
In that case, it wasn't the government. It was the private sector providing it to the government, providing it to the governments involved. So I just think I think this one in particular is a bad example of what I hear you saying, just because I think in this case, attribution was a very valuable part of not letting this escalate in weird ways.
Yeah, but the point you're making... The point you were making is private sector is a lot more willing to go up their confidence level based on whether CISA or FBI or NSA or these had put out some sort of private sector is a lot more willing to put itself out there publicly when they can hitch their wagon to a public attribution statement. And is that not lazy, or is it just it makes sense?
I think it's I don't know, it's lazy. I think it's part of the bizarre calculus of marketing decisions that go into threat intel, because we're talking about the public. But we're talking about the public, right? We're not talking about the products of threat intelligence. We're talking about the publication of the redacted products of threat intelligence. Like those reports were written with next to everything in them and provided in a private circle, either like to government or to consumers, to people who paid for it, to executives. Publication is a subsequent step that has a different calculus. Right. And a part of that calculus is, are we supporting local government? Are we getting some nice stories because we're part of this human political discussion that'll draw headlines? Well, I think the fringe cases that people don't like to talk about, where you can talk about politicization and how that affects the decision making, are about home country. And we've talked about this extensively. We've done it at least in 2 different podcasts and as friends all the time. But why aren't we publishing American tools in the U.S. and so on and so forth?
Yeah, why are you talking about it like this? Like if it's just some trivial issue. Like this is a serious issue. If we're going to look at the whole totality of what the threat landscape look like and we just completely turn a blind eye to Western stuff, it feels like...
No. Well, I think it's unprofessional. I talk about it dismissively, not because I don't have strong feelings about it, but because I've talked about it so much that I feel like a broken record, right? Like I have strong feelings about it. I could summarize my points as there's an intellectual dishonesty to not looking at the whole field. It's blind spots that I think very easily could drive us down some dangerous paths and may have already, in the sense of, what better cover for an APT than to just write everything in good English, right? Like if there's definitely some things there that I'm uncomfortable with. And frankly, there are cases where we aren't serving our customers, and I say we, sort of the larger threat intel industry, out of these bizarre blind allegiances that government doesn't ask you for, right? NSA
like
doesn't come down and say, don't do this. They've never, anything you want, I will tell you that they've never come down and said, don't publish this. But people, a lot of whom have been former govies, feel a need to overcompensate, to show allegiance or whatever. Fine. But there have been times when the USIC has not been properly notified, covered, protected, because people, let's say after the leaking of the equation tools, right? The first people who saw that in the field assumed that was NSA doing their thing.
Right.
They didn't let them know, hey, your tools showed up here. Maybe they weren't supposed to be here. That's one blind spot. The other one is all the same companies sell in Western Europe. And there's no portion of the planet that is worse served than Western Europe, because it's all American companies, for the most part, selling products to Western Europeans, whom are sandwiched in between all attackers.
Right.
They get hit by the West, they get hit by the East, and they get served the same measures as everyone else. So if you're unwilling to provide indicators for what you perceive to be friendly orgs, I hope you're letting your Western European allies and customers know that. Right.
Let me ask a tricky question. Do you think they're blind to it, or it's a blind spot, or everyone is aware of it and just deliberately decide not to?
I think it's
or share. And are those IOCs and telemetry data being shared privately? Even if we, the public, don't hear about Western.
It depends on who you're talking about. So let's characterize this for its peculiarities. You don't just trip over what we'll call friendly APTs, right? There's that word. And I say that because it's not specifically Western. There's a whole alliance of countries that we all are generally in the West sort of in agreement with and don't want to mess with. But it's not Five Eyes in particular. It's not none of that. You don't just track those guys by mistake. They're not as easy as any of the other ones. So they require effort.
Right.
So I think it becomes a matter of willful blindness when organizations that have the skill and telemetry to do so choose not to. But then there's a lot of orgs that couldn't if they freaking wanted to, right? Like, this isn't the kind of thing you're just going to go on VirusTotal and like click a couple of TTPs and you're like, oh, okay, well, here's all of so-and-so's operations. Like, it doesn't work that way. That said, I do think that you're already talking about a rarefied, smaller set of organizations that have the skill, telemetry, and free remit and, time, whatever, to track these things. And among those, It depends. Like, there's people who see it and they talk to their friends, and there's people who see it and they go, I want to have nothing to do with this. And the truth is that you are talking about probably like 50 human beings in all of Earth. And it's going to come down to personalities, and it's going to come down to individual things. And I would challenge
But some companies have
one...
specific policies too, right? I mean, like, companies have publicly said we will not interfere with friendly.
I mean, I don't know that companies have been quite so clear. I wish they were. I think I would feel a lot more comfortable if you just.
I feel I heard that out of
position.
FireEye once. To be fair, it's not companies. I think I may have read that once from FireEye using the friendly thing.
Well, here's where I'll put another sort of wrench in there. Is like, who cares what the company wants?
True.
If we're gonna be really, really honest, right? Like, the whole point is we're being really, really honest, right? You have this tiny brain trust, 200, maybe 300 threat intel researchers worldwide. You have to keep us as happy as presumably we're keeping you, before we just grab our stuff and go somewhere else.
Right.
You know, what we choose to look at is very much on us in a lot of ways. So most of the time when I'm making entreaties like this, it's not about the public, it's not about blogs. It's just to say, like, if the whole world relies on this very small group of people to not just know what's happening, but to document human incursion into the fifth domain, you know, air quotes and pompous stuff along the way, choosing to just kind of carve out parts of history and just leave them on the table is something that I'm personally deeply uncomfortable with. But I don't think that it comes to the companies, right?
Fair enough. I don't want to run out of time before I get a chance to talk about Metador. One thing I just realized when I introduced you is that I did not mention that you're senior director at Sentinel Labs, which is Sentinel One's, what do you call it? Threat intelligence, threat hunting, threat intelligence arm. And at your LabsCon event a couple of weeks ago, you guys made this, did the Metador announcement. And the big takeaway there for me again was this: difficult to attribute, impossible to attribute. I think you made an educated guess that it could even be mercenary actors working for specific nation state. Can you talk a little bit about the decision to go public with something like this when it feels like the paleontology research is not complete? It feels incomplete, and it feels like what's the purpose? Like, help me understand the motivation.
I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm glad that we had this much conversation building up to this point, because it sets the stage for a kind of complicated discussion.
It's a weird, complicated discussion to have. Yeah, go ahead, because my brain is spinning with a million questions, and the guests always complain.
It's precisely because of what we were talking about, right? It's everything that we have been discussing. We don't know who it is. It is rarefied air to find them, right?
Well, so pause for a second and spend a minute on what we're talking about for the folks.
For the folks who didn't read the ginormous report and we're in at LabsCon. So Metador is a so far unattributed APT threat actor, mostly hitting telcos, ISPs, and in some cases universities in the Middle East and Africa.
When you say Middle East and Africa, can you tell me what that means? Middle East and Africa is...
It means Middle East and Africa. And I say this precisely because, there's got to be a certain
let's be honest and blunt there. Are you talking about ISPs in Israel?
No. But at the same time, the reason I'm putting it this way is it's not to be vague it's not to be dishonest. It's just when you talk about telcos and you give somebody a country, you're basically narrowing it down to two organizations. There's a certain amount of just by virtue of giving those victim organizations.
Then say that. If you have. Then say that, because you have outsiders like me thinking that Middle East and Africa is just this broad entire region deliberately put there to just have us. Okay, fair enough.
No, it is, but also it's not just an attempt to anonymize who the victims are to some extent, but also the fact that Metador is so hard to catch and monitor that I don't think we have an authoritative sense of all the organizations that they're in and all the countries that they care about. And like, we were very specific in highlighting that in the talk in the report, because I know how organizations consume these reports sometimes. And a lot of times you look at the top sheet and you go, well, we're not in the Middle East or Africa. We're not a telco or an ISP. Move on. And I don't think we know enough about this threat to really say that. The reason I think, they're important in a variety of ways is they've been operating for years. We haven't caught them before. They have really advanced tooling that they're using primarily in memory. And they have a very pragmatic attack chain where they're not wasting flashy 0 days or whatever, but they know they've studied precisely how to get their tools trampolining into areas like memory, where most folks have next to no capability to monitor. So it does feel like a sort of stray shooting star kind of situation where you're like, if you caught them, you caught them, and chances are you haven't, and that doesn't mean they're not there. So when we come out with this and we say, they're unattributed, I don't say that to cut myself slack from the political fallout of it being, some friendly nation or anything like that. It's more to say, hey, we just spent 9 months on this thing. We've talked to every data provider we could think of, other threat intel companies, who, friends and whatever, other researchers, ISPs involved, friendly governments. We've talked to all of these people and worked on this for many, many months, and we're still stuck with this mystery. And right. I think that's where it gets very significant. It's not to say, oh, we can't attribute this, or we only saw these specific cases. It's to say we've polled a lot of the threat intel space and adjacent organizations that tend to share data, and everyone's coming up blank. What the hell is going on? And I think to that
effect, an abnormal thing? Is that an abnormal
Yes.
thing to run into these APTs where no one has seen, no one has got an idea? This is a very, very unique case, right?
It's absolutely abnormal. I think in a lot of cases, what you could run into is, we just discovered a thing. This other company didn't know about the thing, but when we told them about it, they went looking and they found other stuff.
Right,
That's
right,
normal,
right?
Like, I can say, hey, I'm the first person to identify this activity, but then it turns out that when you talk to your friends or your partner companies or other governments, they go, oh yeah, we were tracking, we had data on this, or we tracked this for a little bit, didn't know what it was and moved on, or whatever. All of that is normal. It's abnormal to knock on everyone's doors and for everybody to go, we have no idea what this is. We don't have any victims. We haven't seen this before. We don't know what this platform is. We just ran the YARA rules, the IOCs down. We get no hits. It's like, okay, right. Well, we need to treat this a little differently, because that doesn't mean they haven't been around, but it does mean that however they've chosen to go about their operations is successful enough in, tiptoeing in the shadows to where they have avoided all of us. And that should be deeply concerning.
And you're convinced that this is an apex predator, apex type actor because when you mention the magnet of threats and sitting on a machine willingly with other adversaries sitting on that machine, it gives the sense that this is an actor that's not necessarily financially motivated, or you're separating them, right?
It's not financially, well, let's scale this back, right? Your question is, do you see them as an apex predator? And I like to be as intellectually honest about these things as possible. I wouldn't put them in the apex predator category. This isn't the next equation. It isn't the next Project Zoran. There's a very rarefied space right. Where the real apex predators operate, right? For me, the concern is they have learned enough things from those apex predators where I wouldn't be surprised if some of them had worked there before. Right. I wouldn't be surprised if, some of these are avid students of the space. But I don't see those organizations at play. What I see is a level of OPSEC and development and tooling and so on that suggests enough familiarity with it. So would I put them as an apex predator? No. I think that my hunch, my gut feeling, my being totally open with you, I wouldn't be surprised if this was some high-end contractor selling their services in the Middle East,
right,
to people who have legitimate nation-state needs, And maybe it involves folks who used to work in this place and that place and the other. And I'm not alluding to Dark Matter, Project Raven, or whatever, but in a way, I am piggybacking off of that public discovery to suggest, look, the space has way more players than we give credit for. And when we sit around and go, this is the US and this is Saudi Arabia and whatever, we're very much oversimplifying massive menagerie of actors into some, middle school geography class that it isn't.
You put out a call for action. You put out a technical appendix with IOCs, analysis of the tool sets and all of that stuff for others to pick apart and hunt for additional components, share. Crowdsource this thing so we can pick apart. Two quick questions here. What are you hoping to accomplish from that realistically? And two, if you could guide me in an area that needs attention, if you could guide the audience and like, listen, we've put out all of this stuff. I would specifically urge you to look at the command and control here. There's something here that's interesting. What would you point them to?
So I would love to be bested, right? Like we did our best work. I would love for anyone to come around and show us the things we missed, show us what we didn't have access to. I do want the mystery solved. Right, like that. It's genuinely, it is without hubris that you go on a stage and go, look, this is the best I could do, and it's cool, but I couldn't, we couldn't really figure this out, right? Like,
what does solving it mean, though?
I think solving it is, in my mind, obviously the holy grail is you get to understand the whole org. But I think in my mind, situational awareness is what threat intel researchers should be striving for at all times. Being able to say, these guys have been around for 6 years. They were into these things before. We actually found them into these other organizations. This characterizes the real set of targets that they care about. They have hacked folks in the US before. They have hacked this. We see a trend in how their victims change. Like that is awareness. What we have right now is, I kept saying it's like the shark fin that broke out of the water, right? Like you're like, okay, there's a predator and we should be scared. I don't know where it was. I don't know where it is now. I don't know how close to me it is, right? Like I'm about to lose a leg and I have no clue, what I'm dealing with here.
What's worth special attention?
What's worth special? Well, first of all, I wish that Light Server in particular, like I try not to call specific orgs out, but like I wish that Light Server in particular had been more pliable and willing to collaborate. When someone's abusing your platform to run high-end attacks, I don't know that you're doing anyone a service by protecting their privacy, quote unquote. So that's one thing. I mean, I'd love to get more visibility out of that side. They use their infrastructure in very particular ways. It would have been nice for more folks to kind of come around with that information. Beyond that, there's two areas to focus on. One is they're living in memory. And once they're in memory, they're not necessarily hard to pick up. The real issue is, as an industry, memory is an underserved point of visibility for a variety of complex reasons we won't get into right now. And frankly, the only company I can think of that operates in this space well and competently and consistently is Velexity. Yeah. So like, shout out to Steve Adair and Tom Lancaster, Paul Raskin-Neres, all these people. They are operating in a rarefied space that more of us should have visibility into. But again, like that's one area where if you have a large enough volatility farm and large enough visibility in the right places, I would expect you to be able to trip over them with relative ease. The other area is the beginnings of their attack chains. They're not using 0 days and stuff at that point, as far as we know, but rather they're being very, very clever and very, very pragmatic about abusing whitelisted binaries from Microsoft, from whatever, to just kick off that first part of the attack chain, the most vulnerable part to visibility, in a way that, Microsoft Defender is going to ignore, right? If it's a Microsoft resource that's loading up the shellcode that starts off this multi-stage attack chain, Defender's not going to look at a Microsoft sign binary and go, I'm going to block all of these, right? So like there's a part there where they're just being clever. And I think that now knowing that there's smoke in that area, that's where I think that's where mere mortals can focus their efforts and go, okay, if I catch that part, I know that something else is going on.
Right. How many of these you would guess and figure are running around out there? Metadors.
These types of actors?
These types of not actors, but these types of campaigns.
You've asked this kind of question of like
all the
my
time
mentor
because
and our friend, right? Like you ask Kostin Ryu this all the time, and I think that's one of the few areas where I think Kostin and I are in like opposition, that we're diametrically opposed. I think Kostin has always been very
confident,
optimistic, confident about sort of how much of this we see. I'm on the other side of the spectrum. I think we see a fragment of what's actually out there between the limitations of telemetry, the siloing of telemetry, right? Symantec gets bought by Broadcom. Broadcom gets rid of all their blogs. God knows what happens to all their tools. This AV company that lived 5 years ago went bankrupt. What happened to their collection? What happened to their telemetry? Like there's so many, like what happens to all the victims who never owned a damn security product ever, right? Like there's so many ways in which our aperture is already very biased into a small subset. It's then fragmented into a series of disconnected silos and then subject to the whims of, did somebody look at the right time? Did they have the right skills to know what they were looking at? And were they able to talk? Could they share? There's so many ways. And like one of the things that comes to mind, since we're talking telcos, is there is this unbelievable hack in the box talk from like 6 years ago about IR at telcos. And it turns from a run-of-the-mill discussion about doing incident response at telcos to, oh, we just so happen to find this apex predator modifying Plex code on Ericsson devices in memory because we just so happen to look at the right time. And I think that's a reminder of, dude, there's so much happening out there. And we're just, you know, we are not this panopticon we think we are, where we can see everything everywhere. We are so far from that. Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me uncomfortable. Like the fact that we're there, that it's luck. It's like every time you can, like I win the lottery. I've won the lottery like 20 times in my career. And that's delightful, but that's not how security should work in general, right?
Let's leave it right there, my friend. Thank you very much for appearing on the show. Come back again as usual whenever we have something important to talk about. Appreciate it.
Anytime, man.